Hello, I'm Katie, and this is the Same Wavelength podcast, YouTube channel, whatever, very cringy. I have yet another guest, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hey, Katie. It's David Weber. I am a biologist for the California Department of Transportation, or Caltrans.
Super important, very amazing. I wanted to ask a little bit about how you got into wildlife science and sort of your interests and passions about nature.
Yeah, I guess I was always interested in wildlife. I think I kind of had romantic dreams of going out in the woods and like studying chimpanzees, or lions or wolves or something out there with like a notebook, just like watching them, taking notes. Um, So I studied biology in college, with a focus on ecology and evolution. Um, and then I went out and worked on a wildlife refuge in New Mexico for a year. Then did some wildlife conservation advocacy work for the National Wildlife Federation. And then I went to grad school where I studied quail, and how managing quail affects other bird species in the Southeast. Um, and gradually I gained a better understanding of what the field of wildlife conservation is. And I realized it wasn't exactly my romantic dreams of being Jane Goodall, even though that's part of it, but it's not all of it. Um, so I got a taste of kind of on the ground, like wildlife management on a wildlife refuge. I got a taste of the nonprofit advocacy world, and then also the science academic world in grad school. Um, and I kind of settled on a more applied conservation role, which led me to being a biologist for Caltrans. So you may wonder like why a transportation agency has biologists, and it's because transportation projects have a lot of impacts to the environment. So it's important that we try to assess what those impacts are, and understand what wildlife will be affected. And to do that, we need to know the biology of the wildlife. Um, and then we can come up measures to try to eliminate those impacts, by adjusting the designs of the projects or minimizing them however we can. So essentially, that's what I do now with Caltrans is I try to conserve environmental resources and wildlife, while delivering important transportation projects, mainly through the environmental permitting process.
Wow, that's honestly super amazing. Like, I think the average person doesn't think about sort of how expansive like wildlife science can be. I think everyone sort of thinks either of Jane Goodall or like someone taking photos of polar bears. Um, but yeah, I don't know. Like, what was there sort of like a deciding factor in why you wanted to do something more applied? Did you feel like you could do more or like have more of a direct effect?
Yeah, I guess I liked the direct effect, like feeling I was like directly contributing to kind of on the ground conservation of wildlife. Um, I enjoyed the academic side somewhat, but I found I wasn't strongly motivated by like ecological research questions,
Hmm.
which you really have to be like motivated by those questions if you
Yeah,
want to be like a full-time researcher. So I was interested in applying wildlife science and biology, um, to conservation, and using that body of science to help us make better decisions, to protect wildlife and other resources we care about, while meeting needs of people
got
through
it.
transportation. So
So is it a lot of like what species live in certain areas, like where do they go, like that kind of work? Or I guess like maybe a better question is like, can you describe a project? I don't know if there's any like government like clearance on describing things, but like maybe give an example of like a kind of specific animal-based problem.
sure, yeah, absolutely. One project I'm working on right now is some highway improvements that go through some wetlands,
Mm,
in like Sonoma and Solano counties. So what I have to do is I have to work with our design team they come up with like the basic project plans. They tell us here's where like we want to be doing this work. And then I have to look on the ground, like what habitat exists there, you know. And in this case, it's a lot of, like I said, wetland habitat, some open water habitat. There's pickleweed, which is like a plant that this endangered mouse, the salt marsh harvest mouse, depends on.
Oh,
Um, yeah, so we have to assess like what kind of habitat is present where we want to do the work. How is the work going to impact that habitat, and then we have to analyze like what are the effects to the species going to be. Um, and if it's a species like the salt marsh harvest mouse, which is endangered, we can't just like go out there and do the work and kill these mice
yeah,
because it's protected by law. So we have to get a permit through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that essentially proves that we have fully assessed the impacts, of the project to the mouse, and that we have avoided and minimized the impacts wherever we can. So that can look like, um, maybe we change the construction staging area so it's not on a big patch of pickleweed,
mm,
and instead put it on a like a already disturbed kind of just like barren gravel area, for example.
got it.
That would be an example of a method of minimizing impacts, to the mouse. Um, so yeah, once we have basically proved that we have done all of that, and then we submit our assessment to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and then they look at our assessment and say, okay, you guys, you guys have implemented these conservation measures. Here are some other conservation measures we want you to implement. But we've determined that with these measures, you are not going to jeopardize the entire existence of the species, and you are allowed to actually harm the species in like a limited amount
Yeah,
to accomplish this project. So yeah, it's a way to like ensure that we can like actually build stuff that people need, while minimizing impacts and conserving wildlife that is endangered and we care about.
got it. So it's very
Yeah.
like it sounds very, no offense, not romantic. It sounds so very specifically logistical of like, what are the parameters of, how much can we affect this species without going over the law or ethics or whatever. Is Do you have sort of like thoughts about the people who said what would happen if we lost all of our legal protections? Is there any sort of like
Mm.
backstop where like if people were like, oh, we actually don't have the Fish and Wildlife Service like telling us that we can't harm these animals, like do you do you think we'd get to a point where we'd actually be able to like still make these decisions like ethically? Or I guess I don't know if people are
Yeah,
thinking about that.
that's a really good question. I think, yeah, I mean, I think these environmental regulations are super important for protecting these species. And I think, without them, there would be nothing preventing developers from just totally, wiping out tons of habitat. I imagine, I think without the Endangered Species Act, many species that are endangered would be extinct by now. You have a lot of species that occupy like a super small area geographically. So if that small area gets, developed or polluted somehow or something, that species could just be gone. Um, so yeah, I think, but people like me, biologists at Caltrans and other agencies, and biologists, yeah, at the regulatory agencies, we all like genuinely care about wildlife and want to protect it, while trying to like accomplish the broader missions of our agencies. So we're trying to balance those things, um, and right now, yeah, like even if Caltrans wants to just like say, yeah, we don't really care about these mice. We just we want to build this highway. It's what we
Yeah,
want to do. We just won't be able to get the permits to do that,
got it.
if we are not analyzing these effects and like trying to reduce them as much as possible. Um, but yeah, it goes beyond, just like trying to barely meet like the bare
Right.
minimum legal requirements. Some things where we're actively trying to do at Caltrans is, enhance connectivity between wildlife habitat.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so a major threat to wildlife is not just loss of habitat, but fragmentation of habitat.
Yeah,
So if you have like, let's say you have a large area of continuous habitat, if you put a highway in the middle of it, that animals have trouble crossing, even if you haven't actually lost that much area of habitat, you've lost that connectivity
got it.
between those two chunks. So that causes lots of effects. You know, decreases, it can decrease genetic diversity because species on one side no longer can breed with species on the other side. Um, and you can get like population bottlenecks, and just it limits their access to all sorts of resources that they need. So fragmentation is a big issue, and roads and other infrastructure are a big part of contributing to that. So one big effort we're trying to work on is improving um, connectivity between habitat by implementing crossing structures in roadways. So
Are you the
that can
people in charge of the like mountain lion crossing?
Yeah, Caltrans is
Oh,
doing that project.
oh my
So yeah,
God. So
I'm so
cool.
thrilled about that example. Yeah, it's like I think one of the largest wildlife crossing structures in the world, maybe the largest. I'm not sure, but yeah, it's this huge like highway overpass in LA. I don't have you seen it?
I don't know that I personally, I'm sure I have if I've been
Yeah,
driving
yeah,
past it, but like LA is like the mountain lion, like
right.
we're obsessed. And our one
Yeah,
of our main mountain lions just died like a year ago. And it was,
P22.
yeah, just like
Yeah,
heart-wrenching. Every store around
R.I.P.
LA has like murals and
Oh,
yeah, it's really important. I mean, every species
hmm
deserves that kind of love and affection, but I think that one really affected people because we viewed, especially in Griffith Park where I live, like
hmm
that was like our mascot. My dad would hear him. I think he was in Los Feliz in the park. Um,
hmm
but like, yeah, that's so important to be able to do work like that. Like, where I don't think there's any sort of city that's not going to damage wildlife. So it's nice to be able
Yeah,
to have some mitigating factors.
yeah. I think that project is so beautiful. It's just like it feels like such like a unselfish thing for humanity to do, like actually investing like a large amount of money and helping uh something that isn't like ourselves,
Yeah.
and to be fair, it's like kind of making up for harm that we've created with this highway. So it's kind of trying to right or fix a harm that we've created. But yeah, just like so inspiring to see that project happening. Um but yeah,
How does
that's a
something like
huge
that work? Like, because I don't know anything about it other than that it
uh-huh.
exists.
Like, what do you mean? How does it work? Like, how does it get built, or like the funding, or like, what part of
I guess like the building and planning part, because I don't care as much about the funding, and I don't know
it?
that you would know more about it.
Yeah, yeah. I think I wasn't involved in that project, but I my understanding is that it'll proceed basically under the same process as just like any other highway project. So like the way you would build a highway, it goes through this whole design process. Where it goes through different design phases, and as they're like advancing the design, they're considering the environmental effects, and they're considering things like lighting and like construction staging and all that. So yeah, my understanding is the development of crossing structures happens the same as like the development of like just other transportation infrastructure projects, but obviously with totally unique elements of like you're
Yeah,
not designing this for people, you're designing it for animals.
right.
So you have to think about like, will animals actually want to cross it? How can you design it so that animals will feel safe crossing it? They're not going to be getting freaked out by the cars passing underneath, and they have enough cover so that they don't feel totally exposed
Mm.
when they're crossing it. So there are a lot of interesting design questions that would go into that.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Like I wouldn't have
Mhm.
thought of, I mean, I'm not an ecologist, but I wouldn't have thought of any of those of like, it's not just you put, a piece of ground with grass and other wildlife. It's
hmm
like you have to make it welcoming, especially given that a lot of these animals don't have trust of human
hmm
structures.
Yeah, totally.
That's super fascinating. Other than like crossings and other like mitigating projects like that, what are some of the like, I don't know, what's like a day-to-day consideration that you're thinking about in ways to maybe things that you don't currently do, but like things that you would want to see implemented in terms of how to make roadways and things better for animals?
Mm, that's a good question. Well, one thing that is like been getting a lot of talk recently is like roadway like pollinator habitat. So the
Mm,
idea is like you plant you have these large like medians between highways where it's usually kind of just like empty grass or whatever, or along side highways. And the thought is that you could plant a bunch of like wildflowers there to support pollinating insects, which many of which are like have been declining.
mm,
Um, but there is a lot of interesting research going on there because obviously cars are very bad for flying insects because they get hit and killed by them. So there are still unanswered questions about whether this pollinator habitat, if you plant like wildflowers in like highway medians, if you're actually just creating like a mortality trap for these
yeah.
instruments, you're for these insects, you're creating like an attraction to them that draws them to a danger or a hazard that they might otherwise not be drawn to. Um, so some kind of best practices I've heard about that are um, you know, planting as far away from the road as possible is better. Also, just like not mowing as much. So
Mm,
instead of like actively planting, just kind of letting it do its own thing because mowing will can inherently like cause mortality to insects. You're just you can be killing the insects that are existing on that vegetation or just destroying any cover that they could have. So reducing mowing, reducing pesticide use are both positive things we can be doing for pollinators on roads. But actively planting is not a settled question yet of whether that's
got it.
beneficial or not. Yeah,
Are the bees still dying? I remember in middle school, everyone was really, I did a report
yeah,
on like
yeah.
colony collapse disorder.
Yeah, yeah, bees are not doing great. I think the focus has shifted a bit, like at least from an ecological perspective, from everybody was kind of freaking out about honeybees.
Hmm.
And honeybees are great. They pollinate a lot of our crops and they give us honey. But honeybees are not native to the US. The European honeybee is not a native species. So while still important, less important ecologically than our native bees. But many of our native bees are not doing well either. So yeah, sad, but it's due to, factors that are contributing to wildlife declines everywhere. Mainly loss of habitat is the biggest one. Things like pesticide use are especially bad for insects. And climate change is a, emerging threat to them as well.
Got it. So just
Yeah.
no good news in the bee world.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there are any like super great success stories there. But the good news is that we are like, better understanding these threats that they're facing. I think we're learning the dangers of pesticides to them. I think people are starting to become more aware of like the harm of even pesticide use, like in your on your lawn or garden, can be
Mm,
harmful to insects. So I think as we learn more about how we are contributing to these declines, we can do a better job of reversing them.
cool. You
Yeah.
mentioned native versus invasive species. Do you want to give like
Mhm.
a rundown for people who do not know the difference or like why
Yeah,
invasive species
sure.
are
Yeah.
invasive?
Yeah, basically an invasive species is a species that like would not be like naturally present in an area, but it has been brought in generally by humans in some way, either directly or indirectly. And that species has managed to survive and expand kind of aggressively in that area where it didn't originally exist. So you have lots of species that will maybe get brought over from other areas, but they are just like not well adapted to the
Mm,
conditions. So they don't persist, or maybe they'll persist, but they just kind of pursue they're chill, like they're not super aggressive, and those aren't typically considered invasive. Generally the term invasive means exotic species that are really aggressive and will crowd out native species, the species that like exist there naturally before human intervention. Um, so yeah, California has tons of issues with invasive species. Lots of invasive weeds. Like it's interesting to think about. Like a lot of landscapes that we look at in California, just like would have looked totally different before European colonization. Like just because so many grasses even um, are from Europe are not native here, and they have totally kind of changed the character of a lot of California landscapes. Um, so some other example, eucalyptus is a big one
Yeah.
you see around California. Those are not from here. A lot of birds, house sparrows, European starlings, not native. There's some mussels like quagga and zebra mussels are invasive. And these species have a number of harmful impacts. They will, like I mentioned, they can displace the native species, so they can outcompete them. They can also cause like serious economic damage. Like a lot of these invasive mussels, like quagga mussels or zebra mussels, will just become encrusted on like pipes in the water and
Oh
parts
wow.
of boats and all sorts of infrastructure in the water and just like cause massive damage. Um, and it's a really hard problem to solve. Like once they're here, it's so hard to control.
Yeah.
Because it just like they get everywhere and it's just incredibly expensive to try to like completely eradicate an invasive species once it's here. So big thing is preventing more invasives from coming here and trying to limit the spread of the ones that are already here.
Wow. Is there, I guess for recent things we have documentation, but like, is there a field of, I guess, like ecological archaeology or something that like looks at when these
Mm,
things, like I think tumbleweeds also were introduced like a really long time
mm,
ago. And there was like
mm,
something I read about like having to do the work to figure out like when and how and like what
mm,
does that mean? And like, I'm sort of wondering how people figure out those things in the first place. Because I imagine everything, like Earth once was just a rock, right? So like everything is, came at a different time or like developed or evolved at a different time. And I'm just wondering how people figure out those things.
mm. Yeah, that's a good question. I remember we had a conversation about this like some years ago, like
I'm sure I was
because
just like
every
everything's invasive, like we're all
right.
terrible.
Yeah, well, that's true. Like species without humans move to different areas. Species like colonize islands before humans even existed. So they do. Animals and plants and all life has an ability to move on its own, and it's just a natural thing that happens. The issue is that humans are just like really really good at speeding that up.
Got it.
And it's like you don't have to think about it as being inherently bad. It's not inherently bad that one species is in like a location that it didn't exist until humans put it there or brought it there. But what are bad are the a lot of the impacts that we
Got it.
want to avoid. So like I mentioned, like economic impacts, causing native species to go extinct, which can harm just ecological processes that are important to us and also just to the stability of the ecosystem in general. So it's kind of like the thing of like, wildfires happen naturally without humans, but people going around setting a bunch of wildfires would not be a good thing,
No.
So it's kind of like too much, too much of something can be bad.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
that also sort of brings up an interesting question of like, um, I imagine in maybe it's hard to describe this. I wonder how much sort of like wildlife work in the last whatever 100 years sort of has bumped up against or like been involved with like our different moral views. Like, is there an
Mm,
extent to which like when you have to do sort of cost benefit analysis, like how many of those decisions would like change over time based on just like pervading views
mm,
that weren't scientific, but were just sort of either like not human savior complex type stuff, but just like
yeah.
how do we determine like what we think are the right choices to make and how much to intervene and how do those things like change over time?
Yeah, that's a super good question. I mean, I think it's almost all like comes down to our values and our like ethics and moral framework that we go on. We have the science, but the science doesn't tell us like what outcomes we want,
Mhm.
or like what our ideal situation is. So that comes down to our values, and I think there are important questions about do we have this um like kind of unreasonable bias against invasive species? You know, do we does it kind of create just this sense of like moral outrage or disgust to have these invasive species when and is that kind of overpowering our like sober consideration of what the actual impacts are? So I think it's important. Yeah, I think that's a super good point to understand that like it's not just science that is like guiding these decisions. You know, it
Yeah.
has to be based in values. Um, and we should be thoughtful about like what values we're imposing. And yeah, I think that there's a lot of good conversations about that. You know, there's a lot of good conversations around like ecosystem services. Like, do we care about ecosystems solely because of the the material benefits that they
Right.
provide to us, or do they have some inherent value, even if they didn't like provide anything that helped us? Would we still want to preserve them? You know, and science can't really answer those questions. So yeah, those are tough questions. We have to think about like, well, what is important to us? What do we care about? Um, and to me, like a lot of times, what it comes down to is just kind of a notion of like respect,
Yeah.
like respect for this broader community that we're a part of, which is like our our human community, but also our the natural community, the environment that we're part of. How do we treat that all with respect? You know,
Yeah. We just got to get Teddy Roosevelt to see a park is beautiful and then he'll save it.
that's right.
Yeah, I mean I do think about that a lot in terms of like I don't know, like do cute or like pretty animals get saved more than ugly ones? Like
Hmm.
how do we eventually create that kind of sobriety of like we're not going to have a human sort of judgment on these things. We're going to like have a more
Hmm.
ecological one or like earthly one. Um
Yeah.
and I guess that just takes like a lot of people and a lot of practice and like a lot of science to get to that point.
Yeah,
Um
and just like talking about it too. Like, yeah, like what
yeah.
what it was it that we actually care about?
Yeah, and
Mm.
I know it's so interesting because I think like it's interesting that like when you started explaining your job, you're like, oh yeah, like we start with like what are the legal requirements, and then we like build in like, what are we allowed to do, but also how do we go beyond that? How is it like this level of respect? That's not just like doing our job, but like doing it well.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
I think it's like I sort of want to be the kind of person that says like, oh, things will get better. We'll like care more about clean air and clean water and saving species in the future.
Hmm.
But it really feels like there have to be those incentives in the first place to be able to like I don't know,
Mm.
maybe get the wider public to care about that. And I don't know if that's an education thing or a cultural thing or like a society thing. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I don't know, maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, most people care like across the political spectrum, people want clean air and clean water. That's like those are one of the most popular things. I think that there is like maybe a disconnect in understanding like kind of the environmental regulations that ensure that we maintain those things. Um, but I think yeah, it kind of starts with this like this public will, which is this is something that we care about. And then that has to kind of like guide our politics and we got these laws in the first place because things got so bad. You know, we had really terrible air quality, water quality was awful in a lot of areas. And so we got these, bedrock environmental laws under Republican administrations. Like we got
Right.
the Endangered Species Act, I think Clean Air and Clean Water Act all under Nixon.
Nixon,
We
yeah,
got
the
the
EPA.
California Environmental Quality Act under Reagan. So, I think caring like about the environment and these like natural resources that we literally depend on for our health, is are pretty universally shared values. Um, so I think connecting those values to like policies that actually support those values can be the more difficult part, but definitely a really important part. And yeah, I guess education. I don't know how to solve that one.
That's for a whole other group of people.
Yeah, yeah.
So we only actually have a few minutes left, and I'm sort of wondering
Mhm.
if continuing this train of thought, you have a sort of hope or desire or like soapbox sort of pitch for how you want maybe the country or the world or like just people in general to sort of think more deeply and critically about these issues and like what issues you think are sort of maybe the most important or things that you care about a lot.
Mm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think we like have to think about like uh what it is we care about and then try to ensure we're doing things in a way that like reaches those objectives. So like um we care about clean air and clean water. We have to make sure we have policies that protect our air and water. We care about wildlife. We're seeing really unprecedented levels of wildlife decline.
Yeah.
So we know we have to do something about that, or we're just going to lose a lot of species that or ecosystems that just contribute to like the beautiful richness of life on Earth right now. Um, and but we also care about things like climate change and housing, and addressing climate change and addressing like housing crises do involve like building. You have to build a lot of
Right.
like clean energy. You have to build housing. Um, so there is a balance there. We want to make sure that we have processes that allow us to build the things we want while protecting the resources we care about. And I think that can be a tough balance, but it's something that we need to be thinking really hard about and focusing more and more energy on, I would say.
Okay. Um, I think that's all like very realistic and not emotional. I feel like sometimes like with stuff like this, I'm like, oh, like we all just need to like hold hands and get together. But like being realistic and like, yeah, like people also need houses and we need to figure out a good way to do it and like the best way to move
Mhm.
forward is really important. That's all the time we have. So thank you so much for like the tiniest amount of information on like a million different things to talk about. And it's really awesome to hear your perspective and like to talk to people who are doing really good and important work like you and that it's not all hopeless.
Thanks. Yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks for having me on.
Of course.